רבותיי, ערב טוב. Thanks to the considerable South African contingent that has arrived, we are all pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Gidon Shimoni of the Hebrew University, who will relate the story of Habonim in South Africa. Now, before we get down to business, let me tell those of you who don't know, let me tell you a bit about the speaker. He was born in South Africa, probably in Johannesburg. He's a past head of the Hebrew University's Institute of Contemporary Jewry, and also held a chair of Israel diaspora relations at the university. His field of teaching and research is modern Jewish history, with particular reference to the history of Zionism and contemporary Jewish communities. His writings include the Zionist ideology, a major study, and a volume entitled Community and Conscience, the Jews in Apartheid South Africa. In addition to his university teaching, Professor Shimoni was responsible for organizing a number of international seminars on Israel diaspora relations under the auspices of successive presidents of the State of Israel. And he has delivered public lectures at universities throughout the world. He is currently chief academic advisor in the planning of the new Museum of the Jewish People at Bet HaTfutzot in Tel Aviv. Incidentally, the Hebrew University's chair of Israel diaspora relations, of which Gidon Shimoni was the first incumbent, was named for Shlomo Argov, Zichron Livracha, Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom, and it was established by the Jewish community in Britain after Argov's murder by Arab terrorists. Lastly, on a happier note, I would just like to add that our speaker made Aliyah in 1961, it's even before I did, together with his wife Tony, and that, like many other couples, they had first met in the South African branch of Habonim. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker, Professor Gidon Shimoni.
Thank you. I should start by connecting the subject matter, the story of Habonim in South Africa, to this society which has existed for many years and is a branch of the famous Historical Society of Anglo-Jewry in England itself. And generally speaking, at historical societies, including our own Historical Society of Israel, papers are delivered. That is to say, research papers, or a recipe for boredom, but at the same time very serious. But I'm, of course, regarding this in the tradition here as a talk. And since the participants in this session are close friends, many of them, and as well as others whom I don't know, I want to, first of all, give a kind of a retrospective justification for a talk on the story of Habonim in South Africa in the framework of the Jewish Historical Society of England. Well, I think there is a justification, not just because the Historical Society has a broad concept of what is Anglo-Jewry and its influence through the British Empire, but substantively, because, there is a largely mythical, although also true in many ways, tradition of belief that the Jews of South Africa are essentially a Litvak community. Now, there is substance to this because in my own estimate in research over the years, I came to the conclusion that one can say that about 70%, approximately 70% of the Jews in South Africa have origin in what is known as the area of the Pale of Settlement and afterwards Poland and Lithuania and so on, that was known as the Litvak area.
Lita?
It's not just Lita, because originally it included parts of the Pale of Settlement that were not afterwards in independent Lita. So there's a lot of confusion that people have about the origin of Jews from Lithuania. But from that area, where there's a specific Yiddish intonation, the Litvische Yiddish intonation of Yiddish, and there are traditions that also are connected with the difference between Chassidut and Mitnagdim. That area did provide the larger part of the Jews of South Africa, there's no question. But when one goes into the history of the Jewish community in South Africa, interestingly enough, one finds that there is a better description of the structure and development of the Jewish and character of the Jewish community in South Africa. And that is something that somebody who was the doyen of writers about the history of the Jews in South Africa, and he was the Secretary General of the Jewish Board of Deputies, Gustav Saren, once very solicitously, very, I would say, suitably phrased, and he used the term Litvak wine in Anglo-Jewish bottles. And this description is good because the structure of the Jewish community and a great deal of its cultural content, which had a bearing on Jewish life, was actually English. And we all know, those of us who grew up in South Africa, that we were acculturated essentially to English culture. You only have to think about the schools we went to, what we sang at the end of every cinema session up to the end of the 1950s, God Save the Queen. I went to a school which was alongside of a school called King Edward's, and my school was called Athlone, named after the Earl of Athlone. Our houses were divided according to British tradition with prefects, and the house I was in was the House of Tudor, and there was the House of Stuart and the House of York. I mean, our culture was essentially an English culture. But not only that, even the Zionism of the Jews of South Africa, when you look into the original history, you find that the founders and the leaders up to about the 1930s were all Anglo-Jews. Many of them had been born in Germany and lived for a time in Britain. Others were born already in Britain, and they came to South Africa mostly in connection with gold mines, businesses, and so on. And they were the founders not only of the first synagogue in 1841 in the Cape, but also the founders of the Zionist organization, which was the first organization of a countrywide nature to be established in South Africa. Before, there was a thing called a Jewish Board of Deputies, as for example there was in Britain. It was a representative organization of the Jewish community, and it became that in South Africa too. But it was only formed about 5 to 10 years after the foundation of what was called the Federation of South African Zionists. And in fact, the Zionists opposed the creation of the board because they said, we are the representatives of the Jews in South Africa. And they had performed that function in various ways before a board of deputies was formed. This is unique about the Jewish community in South Africa. There's no other place in the New World where a Jewish community had a Zionist organization as its first organizational structure of a nationwide, countrywide nature. Now, how does it happen that Anglo-Jews were the founders of that Zionist tradition? Because when you look at the history of Anglo-Jewry itself, there was a tremendous struggle which dominated the life of the Jewish community. This is something on which I myself have done considerable research and written. The struggle between Zionists and non-Zionists and anti-Zionists in Britain. As I say, it was a central feature of the life of Anglo-Jewry right up to the creation of the State of Israel. And there were actually organizations that were anti-Zionist. And I'm not speaking only of the Haredi world. But in South Africa, there was no Haredi anti-Zionism. The only religious grouping was an Orthodox grouping, which from the beginning was aligned with national religious Zionism, that is to say, with the Mizrahi movement. And apart from that, there was very little opposition to Zionism, also amongst the Anglo-Jews. And some of them were closely connected with Anglo-Jews in England who fought against Zionism. You know that famously that in the period when there was an attempt to attain the Balfour Declaration, there were leading Anglo-Jews who absolutely opposed what became the Balfour Declaration. Now, in South Africa, it seems that the explanation lies in the nature of the society. Because the structure of South African society was one in which you had not only a broad pluralism that divided in a sense in which every person lived his or her life from birth to death, including education and so on, and languages within a separate cultural environment enforced on the society, but also the dominant white population was divided between two national identity groupings, the Afrikaners and the people of British extraction. So this isn't unique in the history of the Jews. There were many communities in Europe, for example, in the Baltic lands, where the Jews were between various national groups. And in the New World, you have a very similar situation in Quebec, between the Quebecois and the English speakers. But in South Africa, this was a very formative factor in the development of Jewish identity, because it left the possibility for Jews to be neither Afrikaners nor British, but ethnically speaking, and not just in terms of religion, a separate, distinctive group of its own. Now, it wasn't as distinctive as the Afrikaners were from the English in general, because the acculturation took place into one of these groups mainly, although there were small numbers of Jews who also acculturated into the Afrikaner group, but they were rather the exception. And over time, almost all merged within the framework of the English acculturation. Now, in that context, the ethnic religious identity of the Jews in South Africa is its major significant feature in the comparative context of contemporary or modern Jewish communities in the New World. And the development of Zionism is actually an expression of that ethnicity. In other words, Zionism was the expression that religious ethnic identity with a strong ethnic emphasis led to. So Zionism really is the characteristic that is the most striking about the Jews in South Africa, and that's the context in which a youth movement such as Habonim developed, of course. Now, you have then these two characteristics of the Jewish community, which I think stand out when you look at South African Jewry in a comparative context. The homogeneity, relatively speaking, but it wasn't only Litvak, it was Litvak wine in Anglo-Saxon bottles, the institutional structure, incidentally including the synagogue structure. You know, Litvaks didn't come with top hats in Shadova or Kovno to shul. But in South Africa, when I grew up and went to shul, the gabbai sat like he was at the United Synagogue in London. So these are the features that I think are very important, that certainly justify the English Historical Society talking about the development of something in the Jewish community of South Africa. Now, the founding of Habonim also emanated from Britain. What happened was simply this. There was a young scholar, the son of a rich jewelry merchants of the firm of Lurie, but it wasn't just Lurie, it was Katz and Lurie in Johannesburg. And his name was Norman Lurie, and he went to study at Oxford. And while he was in England, by the way, his brother, Arthur Lurie, afterwards was one of the first ambassadors of Israel, including to Britain. And I think that this famous boutique hotel that's opened in Tel Aviv, called the Norman, is actually an offshoot of his economic enterprises, because when he came to Israel, he was involved in the film industry and in tourism and so on. Now, he met an extraordinary person by the name of Wellesley Aaron, who was British, of German Jewish extraction, very interesting career. And if I tell you, his grandson is Broza, the singer. David Broza, yeah. And Wellesley Aaron was a person who was involved at some stage in many activities connected with Zionism. He was a helper of Weizmann at one point. He was involved in the period of the Balfour Declaration. He fought in the Second World War, but he was also involved in helping young people in the East End of London, together with a man by the name of Henricus, who was one of the leaders of the anti-Zionists in Britain, by the way. Basil Henricus, the founder of an organization which was specifically anti-Zionist, that went on being so even in the first years of the creation of the State of Israel, a phenomenon that didn't exist in South Africa. Now, Wellesley Aaron was also active in the Boy Scouts, and he came to the conclusion that it was necessary to fight assimilation amongst young peoples by creating a Boy Scouts in the Jewish population, within the Jewish popular community in Anglo-Jewry. And one of the people in his circle was Norman Lurie. And together they founded Habonim, they called it. Call us not your bonai, your sons, ela banai, ela bonai, but your builders. And they, around this idea of the builders of the Jewish people, they created a thing they called Habonim. The first Gedud they called Gedud Trumpeldor. And Norman Lurie was involved in the founding of it. A year later, Lurie came back to South Africa. And he recreated the same thing exactly and became the madrich of a first Gedud with 12 people in the Dorfentine suburb of Johannesburg, and it was called Gedud Trumpeldor. Some of us, I and certainly it's sitting here, were members in a later generation of that very same Gedud Trumpeldor. Now, within a year or two, there were some 15 units with hundreds of members throughout South Africa. And almost the same happened in Britain itself. And the idea caught on tremendously. But what was the nature of this activity? What did he actually found? Now, it's interesting. If I read you, for example, something that Norman Lurie wrote in 1931 in the magazine called The Judean, and the article was called A Cultural Jewish Youth Movement by Norman Lurie, BSc Economics. That was from Oxford, I think. Now, he said, Habonim is primarily intended to apply to the category of children between the ages of 12 and 16. It contends that children are attracted to active rather than passive interests, that devotion and service to an ideal are rarely motives which urge the child mind to activity. Habonim is an entirely voluntary movement, which children join because it is good fun. It is based on the fundamental realization that children can be most effectively taught through competition, games, play acting, storytelling, etc. Now, he says, Habonim has chosen the correct framework, making coercion on the part of parents or other authorities needless. Through it, Jewish youth has found a satisfying outlet for its energies and has rallied to the cause. The methods of Habonim are purely educational and in no sense propagandist. it is maintained that political issues are no fit meat for immature minds, and thus every Jewish boy and girl must find a place in the movement. Now, actually I want to change glasses if you don't mind. This statement seems so strange for anybody who was in Habonim in later generations. As for the people in Habonim today, this must be absolutely absurd. Now, there's a reason why he said non-political, and the same applied in England. Wellesley Aaron in England also had a struggle. In England, it was a struggle to prove that it was not excessively oriented on Zionism, because he couldn't alienate people who were not Zionist. He wanted them all to join the Boy Scouts, especially since one of his friends and associates in this was this Basil Enriquez, a Jew, as you see from the name, of Sephardi Portuguese extraction. And in South Africa, it was the opposite. There was a sense that it isn't enough Zionist, because in South Africa there already were a lot of what could be called young adult movements. There was a movement in Cape Town called the Judeans, with many branches. Amongst the people involved was who became the judge, well-known judge and leader of the Jewish community in South Africa as a young person, Herbstein. And in the other areas, there were young Israel societies. And there were, of the age group about 17, 18, 19, 20, there were young people's groups, and they were flourishing by the late 1920s. Habonim was formed in 1931. And in 1932, they actually combined together to create a thing that was called the South African Zionist Youth Council, which brought all these groups together. Now, the problem was that they wanted Habonim, which was the first youth organization to cater for people under the age of 16, to be the junior section of the junior movement. And they expected the graduates out of Habonim, when they reached the age of 17, to join the youth council in the broader sense. Habonim, speaking about independence, was to be free of that influence. And the founder of Habonim, Norman Lurie, was at the same time also the founder, as was his accomplice in Britain as well, of a sports organization, which in Britain was first called Bar Kokhba and then afterwards became the Maccabi. And Lurie founded Maccabi. And Lurie thought that the correct connection would be Habonim to Maccabi, both non-political but with the emphasis on sport. So the conflict that took place, I found this fascinating when I started studying the history of the movement. What they were arguing about in the early 1930s was this question of independence for this Boy Scout version of a Jewish movement, but against the Zionist Youth Council. Well, eventually they reached some understanding. The Youth Council accepted that Habonim would remain independent, and in fact, the Habonim, right until 1979, never took up full representation on the Zionist Youth Council. It just sent observers in order not to be politically involved. So that was the kind of issue that concerned them. Now, in the formation of Habonim and its aims, there wasn't even the mention of the word Zionist as such. They said to inculcate knowledge and concern for the Jewish heritage and its implications for the building up of the land of Israel. Phrases of that kind. And therefore, what happened in the first 10 years already, after the creation of Habonim, was really an enormous transformation. But it's not unusual, because this is precisely what happened in the history of all the classic Jewish youth movements in Europe. like the Blau-Weiß in Germany, like the early Hashomer Hatzair, they all started off as youth movements with an ideology that sought to be independent and non-political. But they were all caught up in the tremendous force of the Zionist movement. As youth movements of a non-Jewish nature were caught up, lehavdil, in the development of nationalisms, which, for example, in the case of Germany, even led to the Nazis. But the power of the ideological movement in a period, think of the 1930s, the condition of European Jewry, the rise of anti-Semitism in every part of Europe, manifested above all in the fascist and Nazi parties, and all of this leading to something that they couldn't even know, of course, which was the Holocaust in the Second World War. In that period, the power, ideologically, of Zionism was irresistible for young people who were organizing themselves in any framework. And the same thing happened in Britain and in South Africa. And remember, at this time, there were no other youth movements. Habonim was the first in the English-speaking world. There were only these young adult groups that I mentioned earlier, like the Young Israel Societies. So it really controlled the whole field. But the activity became overwhelmingly oriented on the ideal of Zionism, which very soon began to become the idea that young people have to be the forerunners of the movement of Zionism. They have to be the ones who go to live in the land and devote their lives to the construction of what was being done here. So the power of this was very great. In addition, meanwhile, some other youth movements came into existence which were politically founded. Particularly in about 1936, a small Hashomer Hatzair developed in South Africa. In Britain, there were even more developments of that kind because of the proximity to Europe and migrants who were coming all the time from Europe. For example, the beginnings of what became Bnei Akiva developed out of Jews from Germany who came to Britain. But in South Africa, a small Hashomer Hatzair, which consisted initially of young people who had not been born in South Africa and were still Yiddish speaking and had come with their parents to South Africa, mostly from the towns of Lithuania. And they included some people with names that afterwards became famous, including ones who came to live in Israel, like, for example, the Skikneys, whose son, Lawrence Harvey, became a famous actor in Britain. They were all part of this early group of Hashomer Hatzair. Larry Skikney himself was, Lawrence Harvey was not born in South Africa. He was born in Lithuania, came as a small child. And they already brought a Hashomer Hatzair ideology that had developed mostly in Austria and in Poland, and it was based on chalutziut, as they called it, and they even attempted to create a hachshara farm, which didn't maintain itself for very long in the 1930s, and some of them influenced the people in Habonim of their age group. So within Habonim, there developed a trend amongst the Madrichim age, who went about creating a new shichva, and they called it the Shomrim shichva. And in the Shomrim shichva, which also constituted the body of Madrichim for the Bonim shichva, which was from 12 to 16, and which functioned on the basis of the Boy Scouts method. Each unit was divided into kvutzot, and there was a system, a wonderful system actually, of sub-leadership, which created older kids educating and leading younger kids. So that 15-year-olds were leading 12 and 13-year-olds that were called Rashei Kvutzot. And that was the system in which those of us who grew up in South Africa up to the 1970s approximately, that's the way we experienced our experience in Habonim. Now, in this framework of Hashomrim, they began to develop people who said the goals of the movement should be oriented very directly to the idea of personal aliyah, and particularly settlement in the kibbutz framework. Now, they were strengthened by the fact that they were the beginnings of a process where the World Zionist Organization began to help sponsor the sending of what were called shlichim, who came from kibbutzim. The first shaliach to come out to Habonim was a man by the name of Mogi Margolis, who was a graduate of Habonim in Britain and lived on Kfar Blum, which was the first British Habonim settlement, and was joined by members of Habonim from other countries, including the United States and South Africa. And he was followed by a man who was originally from South Africa and had come to Kfar Blum, called Aryeh Ziv. And these were the earliest shlichim who came, but Mogi Margolis brought Anglo-Jewish chalutziyut via Kfar Blum to Habonim, to the Shomrim Shichva, and they began to develop an internal struggle which took place primarily towards the end of the Second World War. During the Second World War, there was no, facility and time to engage in these things, but some of those who came back from the war, who had been in Habonim in the earlier years, who included people who afterwards became very famous in Israel. For example, one of the founders of the first group, together with Norman Lurie, was Louis Pinkus, who in later years became the chairman of the World Zionist Organization. And there were many others. One of them was the young Brody. Jules Brody was his name. And they had already fought in the Second World War and come back. Jules Brody came back and studied together with Mandela at that point, at the end of the Second World War, in the law department at the university in South Africa. So that's the generation we're talking about. Now, they consisted of people with differing views, some of them still very much rooted in the original notion of an independent youth movement without indoctrination. And Zionism, and not to speak of chalutziyut and kibbutz, meant strong indoctrination of kids. The person who was the official head of the movement lived in Cape Town, and his name was Bertie Stern. He was an old Boy Scouts and Second World War personality, and there were similar ones also in Pretoria and in Johannesburg. There was the famous Harry Shevitz in Pretoria. These were all people who came strongly influenced by their military experience in the Second World War. They brought all the songs that were the original songs of the movement from the Second World War, which became parodies like Habonim, Strong Builders, and so on, based upon their experiences in the war. And a conflict developed between the young Chalutz developers who found it difficult to actually make the movement adopt these aims, but instead formed what they called Chalutz registers, where those who believed they would want to go, first of all, to train in Hachsharot, which were being established, to go to Israel. This is already Israel, after 48, that you signed the Chalutz register, and they numbered already in Habonim a few hundreds of people in Cape Town and Johannesburg and the other towns. And these were people who were committed to Chalutz Aliyah. Now, Bertie Stern was very much against this. It's not that he wasn't a Zionist. There were no non-Zionists. Zionism was a given in all of this. The issue was one of education as against indoctrination, of values. And the argument was you cannot force people to do this, and certainly you can't impose upon them socialist ideologies which went together, of course, with the influence of the kibbutz idea of settlement and so on. And at one point, he even dared to suspend a whole lot of madrichim in the Chalutz register. And there were all sorts of maneuverings behind the scenes. Most of the activity took place in Cape Town, which from that time onwards became really the most vibrant centre of the Habonim movement in South Africa. The activity continued to be conducted mostly from Johannesburg, but if you look at who came to run the movement in all the years following, the numbers who came from Cape Town are overwhelming. They would simply move to Johannesburg in order to run the movement from Johannesburg. But the intensity of the movement in every aspect was very, very strong in Cape Town rather than in Johannesburg. However, Johannesburg was the largest centre, and it was the centre of South African Jewish life, and so that was always the headquarters. Now, the development that took place paralleled the same as had happened in Britain already before the Second World War. And that is, the movement became officially Chalutzik. No movement aims were changed. Everybody worked from the same thing they called the Habonim Handbook, which simply said, the Jewish heritage and our contribution to the Jewish heritage, including Palestine, and as good South Africans. So there was an enormous gap between the official statements of the movement and what was actually happening. Bertie Stern had to resign, and this other person I mentioned, Jules Brodie, who was not himself a chalutz and not intending to come a chalutz. All his children at one stage or another came to Israel, and in most cases also left Israel. This is the story of almost all of us. And he agreed to be the figurehead, a kind of a non-executive leader. In fact, what happened was that the person who was the Maskir Klali, exactly as in England, by the way, became in effect the official head of the movement, although not from a constitutional point of view. And the person called the Manhig, in this case Jules Brodie, who went on until 1985 about, actually acted as a representative in vis-a-vis the community and a guide, and in a fine spirit accepted that the movement had become a Chalutz movement. Hachsharot were established, Garinim were formed, and I won't go into those kind of details, but this became the focus of Habonim. It was not until 1959, and here one already enters the scene and one is talking about one's own life experience. Because I, as a young kid, joined Habonim in about 1952. In 1959, I was already a full-time worker in Habonim of some years standing, and I became the Maskir Klali, and we had a big, it was called the Moetza V'Ida, and for the first time, we actually reformulated officially what de facto had happened, that is to say, made it de jure in the formation of the goals and aims of the movement. The aims were to speak clearly of aliyah, as personal aliyah, and of the goal of chalutziut, which meant orientation to kibbutz. But even then, there wasn't agreement in the leadership of Habonim. There were grave arguments still around questions of conscience and education, indoctrination, and so on. And there was a grave concern that you cannot make kibbutz alone the goal, that there are other forms, as people said, of chalutziut. There were people who should be trained in professions, and it was never established in Habonim in South Africa, as had been established in equivalent movements, for example, in South America, in Argentina, in Brazil, and Uruguay, that you had to commit yourself to not only go on aliyah, as it was called. The Americans made it make aliyah. We used to say on aliyah. And I think in Britain they also said on Aliyah.
Yeah.
You see, again, the British tradition was constant.
They wait on Aliyah.
Yeah. And the formulation of these aims was a struggle as to how to word it. There wasn't agreement that it should be kibbutz only. There was never an accepted tradition throughout the movement that you do not study at university. Now, what killed the Chalutz movements in countries like South America, was not killed them, but maybe weakened them to the point where they became much weaker than what Habonim was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in South Africa, was the fact that they stopped people studying at university. HaShomer HaTzair did that in South Africa, but they decimated themselves. They would send people on Aliyah at the age of 17 eventually. They stopped people studying, put them straight onto Hachshara, and they simply lost the intellectual leadership and the continuation that Habonim always had. Habonim was a movement led by students. There was a complete overlap between the Jewish students and its own movement, which was secondary in the eyes of the leaders of Habonim, because they devoted themselves to the youth movement itself. But some of them became active at the same time in student groups. And it was a student movement, and people studied, and it had a high intellectual level. And there were some who gave the utmost dedication and didn't study, but studied trades. And they were a very strong example and role model, but by and large it wasn't accepted. Now, this question of education and indoctrination is something that's worth looking at a little more closely. I want to quote to you how it was formulated and how it was explained in the directives for the programming of the Shomrim, the older age group within the youth movement, throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, more or less. And the clause runs as follows. It was now called Ichud Habonim, by the way, because the youth movements of Habonim had united throughout the world for the first time, so they call themselves Ichud Habonim. Ichud Habonim in South Africa regards Chalutz Aliyah, but then it said in brackets, and this there was a great argument, cooperative settlement, agricultural or otherwise. That was the compromise, in brackets, defining, in other words, Chalutz Aliyah, not just a kibbutz, as the highest challenge facing its members. Ichud Habonim demands that its members face the challenge and reach personal self-realization in their own way, according to their own convictions. Now, you can see the weight of the discussion that went into this formulation. Now, in the guidelines, which were used for talking about this in the Chavorot of the Shomrim Shikva, I want to read to you the formulation so that you can get a sense or remind yourselves in some cases of how this was understood. Well, on the one hand, the guidelines made it clear. Habonim believes that for youth there can be only one expression of Zionism, and that is Aliyah, meaning settlement in Israel, without saying it has to be Chalutz Aliyah. Now, and it went on to say, it must be the youth who undertake the task of national and spiritual reconstruction, which is today transforming Judaism and the Jewish people. Al tikra banaich ela bonaich, and the path towards such building we proclaim at the end of every gathering, Alei uvnei, go up and build. Now, these were the typical slogans. Now, in the discussion, this is part of the explanation. The movement's aim in regard to Aliyah is not Aliyah, but to produce a type of person who will be emotionally and intellectually able to cope with the challenge of Aliyah, and with the practical problems of its implementation if the challenge is accepted. You remember the term, both in England and in the United States and in South Africa, in the youth movements, and particularly in Habonim, but not only, self-realization, which actually a better term would have been self-actualization. But Hagshama Atzmit was the term. It's meant to be the creative or positive fulfillment of one's personality. This may be considered to represent the loftiest educational principle that any educational movement or institution can accept. Behind it is the assumption that each individual possesses a unique personality in terms of which he is to be understood and respected. Through the healthy development of that personality and its fulfillment in a way of living which fosters its creative characteristics, the individual achieves happiness. It should be noted, of course, that by virtue of our ideal of a personal social revolution on the part of youth, this concept of self-realization is enclosed within a specific framework. That is to say, in a sense, we ask the individual to find his happiness or his self-realization within the framework of Aliyah and life in Israel. This then begs the question, what has ultimate primacy in a case where a person's self-realization does not appear to lie in this framework on account of very personal reasons of one sort or another? This question is, of course, open to debate. The writer of this booklet feels, by the way, I was the writer of this booklet, feels that the answer must give ultimate primacy to the individual rather than to the ideal, even the ideal of Aliyah. No one can have the audacity to glibly judge his fellows in matters of deep subjective conscience. Each person must make a decision in terms of his own personality in response to the challenge of Aliyah, as well as to any other challenges that may crop up in his lifetime. There must and should be a sincere struggle inside over such crucial matters. Now, in other words, the formulation was Habonim has to educate so that the person is a type of person who will know what the challenge is and face up to it. But the ultimate decision is that of the individual. And this was very much the way in which Habonim, at any rate in South Africa, educated. Ironically, the formulation of Aliyah and Chalutz Aliyah, even in the broader definition, took place at a time when it was actually beginning to wane. Now, this is a characteristic historically in many movements, that you have a de jure statement that comes after the fact. Because by then, Hachshara had been closed for Habonim, and by then it was actually a combined Hachshara of all the youth movements, although Habonim was the main ingredient. And instead, people were going directly to Israel, also to kibbutz. And one of the things that had changed it was that in 1955 already, the Zionist Federation in South Africa created a unique scheme to facilitate Aliyah of young people. It created a scheme which was motivated by some of the people who had formed Machal in 48 to fight in the War of Independence. Machal had a strong core of the madrichim of the youth movements, including, of course, Habonim, but not only Habonim, and others who hadn't belonged to youth movements. And only a half of the Machal people over the years actually settled in Israel. Many came back to South Africa. But the idea was a scheme that would bring people to a slightly shortened army training directly into the Israel army within the framework of Machal. And they didn't need to stay in Israel. Most of them returned to South Africa. But at any stage in which they would come back to Israel, they were already citizens who had done their army service, and in case of need, they would be available like Machal was to come. Actually, the need became activated almost immediately, because this was 1955, and within a year there was the Sinai campaign, and the crisis before the Sinai campaign, and a call for volunteers. So already some of them were here and were able to participate in the Sinai campaign. And there were generations afterwards that went on for about 10, 12 years who came to live in Israel in that way as young people. It drained some of the leadership of the youth movements, made it impossible to create a hachshara again. Some of the youth movements were almost destroyed by it. For example, a youth movement called B'nai Zion, which was founded by the general Zionists, and in other countries was called Hanoar HaTzioni, lost most of its leaders, many of whom settled afterwards mainly in Kibbutz HaSolalim in the north of Israel. In 1961, B'nai Zion disbanded. It had lost a lot of its madrichim. It had been weakened because its political party ceased to be a general Zionist party and became a non-party association. And so it disbanded and joined in with Habonim, providing some very important madrichim for later generations. Prior to that, the Zionist Socialist Youth Movement, Dror, also dissipated, partially also because it had lost a wave of senior madrichim, and Habonim had then become even bigger. It was by far the largest youth movement in South Africa. And this new scheme, in effect, changed the nature of the process of Aliyah for the older generation in Habonim. And therefore, Hachshara and Chalutziyut were actually on the decline. There was a last attempt made in about 1960-61 to create Hachshara. It failed and was abandoned. No Hachshara after that time. Now, the fact of the matter was, though, that in the spirit that I've described from an educational point of view, Habonim continued to function, and I think reached its peak in many ways by the mid-1960s. Now we are already, of course, in the period which is the greatest and most unusual, almost unique characteristic of the situation of the Jews of South Africa. The confrontation with the position of living in a society based on vile, criminal, and racial prejudice and discrimination. The apartheid system, which was a refinement and systematization of the existing societal system that the parents of all those who were in Habonim had come to in the first place. But now more severe, more oppressive, condemned by the whole world. How could the values of this youth movement withstand the situation in which it was unconscionable to accept what was happening around them? In this context, one has to be aware of the dilemma that faced the entire official Jewish community. In effect, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I want to explain what was the record of Habonim facing this challenge. Well, the bottom line is that Habonim accepted in practice the policy of the leadership of the Jewish community, which came from the executive body of the Jewish community called the Jewish Board of Deputies, which was overlapping almost entirely with the Zionist Federation's leadership, except a division of responsibilities. The Zionist Federation for everything concerned with caring for Israel, the Board of Deputies representing the interests on matters like anti-Semitism, immigration, and so on within South Africa. The leadership followed a policy that was described as non-political intervention. That is to say, what the Jewish community formulated over many discussions and deliberations was individual Jews should function as they see is right and proper by the standards of Jewish historical experience or the Jewish religion or whatever, but only as individual citizens. Jews were citizens, they were entitled to citizens' rights as whites. They're entitled to fight the system or accept the system as they see fit, but not to involve the Jewish community qua community. Why? Officially it was said because there is no such thing as a policy in the Jewish community. That wasn't really true, because there was a consensus amongst all Jews that apartheid was unconscionable. But certainly it would endanger the Jewish community, because alignment in a situation in which all opposition was crudely suppressed with vicious laws, 90-day detentions, bannings, arrests, tortures, and whatnot, the Jewish community adopting an official stand in resistance to apartheid definitely carried grave dangers. Now, those Jews who were actually a majority in many ways amongst the whites who were resisting apartheid at risk to their lives, of course, condemned the Jewish community and said the Jewish community should follow. This is an issue, of course, of great interest that I'm not going to go into. But Habonim accepted this. But within Habonim, for those who were sufficiently ideologically sophisticated and aware, there was a twist of Zionist ideology which I think didn't exist in Jewish communities anywhere else among Zionists. Because the classic Zionist position is there's galut, there's persecution, there's non-fulfillment of Judaism except in our own homeland. That solves the Jewish problem. In the case of Jewish communities that were living under emancipated conditions, enjoying real freedom, not like in Europe, and more so in those places, and there was South Africa and the south of the United States were the two examples in the world mainly, in which the Jews were part of the privileged group, not persecuted, and participating in a society that discriminated against and persecuted other people. In that situation, this was a situation of galut. The term galut was something that was very freely used. In galut, in that situation, what happened was it was a moral galut dilemma, because the Jewish community was saying, in the name, you can resist apartheid as an individual. Don't do it in the name of Judaism or Jewish identity. So this is an abdication of Jewish values. Do it as a person, not as a Jew. The only place where you can do it as a Jew and a person in one, without the dichotomy, is in your own country. The Jew who lives in his own country is a Jew and a man without dichotomy. If he acts in any way he chooses according to the values he thinks are the values of his Jewish historical experience, or Judaism as religion, or whatever, he does so without dichotomizing the man and the Jew. That is galut in our condition. This was a kind of an ideological twist. Now, it interests me in particular because, you know, my main field of interest actually academically, and the thing about which I most worked, was the study of the Zionist ideology throughout the world from the beginning. And so I see this as a very interesting nuance which didn't exist in the condition that Jews had in other places. And that was the answer that was given. So the position in Habonim was, we are devoting ourselves to the preeminent cause of the Jewish people in our time. The time of post-Holocaust and the emergence of the Jewish people's own country, Israel. That's the primary cause. And you cannot divide your allegiance from an idealistic point of view to a cause which goes away from that. The people, we agree in every way with those who oppose apartheid who are Jews. And we agree that the imperatives of Jewishness are with them in doing so. But they don't care for the cause of their own people. And that's our task. They, to the extent that they appeal to the Jewish community, wanted simply to be an instrument for the universal cause for which they are fighting, valid as it may be. And that was the struggle between the two points of view within the Jewish community. And I think it was strongest amongst the generations of Habonim in the late 50s, the 60s, and into the 70s, insofar as they confronted that situation. Now, I'm drawing to a close, and I want to address the question of what happened afterwards. Because if we look at Habonim today, I had a phone conversation with the present Manhig of Habonim. His name is Errol Anstey, he lives in Cape Town, and I asked him to give me a brief summary. It's wonderful, he did it on WhatsApp with a spoken report. There is a camp of 600 people that's taking place right now at a wonderful campsite in the Cape. No, it's called Onrust. And it belongs to Habonim. And it's rented out throughout the year to African and coloured groups who have youth movements for pay, and that subsidizes Habonim of today. Gives them a fine income, and they're independent financially. They don't need the Zionist Federation, which has less money than they have in today's South Africa. He says that he estimates the membership of Habonim throughout South Africa is about the 700, 800. And they get about 600, which is a great achievement to the camp. Actually, the activity of the movement is really the camp. A 3-week wonderful camp. They have at this camp 11 people from the UK, from Habonim in the UK. They have 2 or 3 from Australia. They have 6 or 7 from kibbutzim around Gaza. Young people who've come out to the camp. So they have interesting increments. They're part and parcel of the camp. They don't have weekly meetings. Long ago, the system moved away, in the 1970s already, from the system of the Boy Scouts, of Rashi Kvutzot and so on. They have age groups, like in the Israeli youth movements, based on the school grades, and they're co-educational. In the early years, Habonim, like the Boy Scouts, had separate units for boys and girls. And they don't really have weekly meetings. They have activities, organized activities, seminars, outings, mini camps, mainly groups that come to Israel. They organized apparently a group that came on birthright, but one of the conditions was that they have to afterwards come as madrichim to the camp, which indicates some kind of problem about motivation. And they're very active in those more limited ways. The quality of the participants, no less than ever in the past. The brightest students, the ones who are the head boys at Herzliya School and at King David School, they're always leaders in Habonim. Except that many more today are leaders in Bnei Akiva. Bnei Akiva has bigger camps, more activity. It's the strongest youth movement amongst the youth movements. It has been for the last 20 years already. Beitar has gone out of existence. Hashomer HaSeir no longer exists. So it's really Bnei Akiva. And Bnei Akiva is completely committed to the transformation that took place in what was once Hashomer HaDati, in the early days up to the creation of Gush Emunim and the settlement movement. And its graduates, many of them go to settlements, and it's fully in conformity, and it has produced those who are the leaders of the Jewish community in almost every sphere. Now, if I go back to 1980, when Habonim was still the strongest and the biggest youth movement and had camps of 1,000, 1,500, for example, and had weekly activities and so on, I remember coming to South Africa in 1980. Itzkar Manovitz was the chairman, he was from Habonim, of the Zionist Federation, which was still a very strong movement, still the preeminent organization in the Jewish community. The chairman of the Board of Deputies was a man by the name of Bumi Abramovitz, who was a madrich when I was a kid in Habonim. The Secretary General was Dennis Diamond, living in Israel, who was from Habonim. Almost every institution in the Jewish community in South Africa, not to speak of many who had come to live in Israel, were from Habonim. Today, I think you could say the same thing about Bnei Akiva. That's the situation. By the way, it's similar elsewhere. It's quite similar in Britain, not just in South Africa. And now I come to the final point. What about the ideology? Go back to what I quoted earlier and think of the origins of Habonim. Well, it's interesting. In some ways, it's gone back to the time of Norman Lurie, in respect of personal aliyah, for example. Oh, it's still part of the aims. Let me quote to you some of the recent formulations of the aims. Well, they changed the ones that I quoted over the years. Those lasted up to about the end of the 1970s, up to or the first half of the 1980s. And they changed it, and what they say is, I must actually quote from their statements. They say there are three main aims, or categories of aims, to Habonim. There is, I've got to find the actual, nowadays I have trouble changing glasses for all of this. There are three pillars, they call it, in their movement aims over the last few years. There is the socialism pillar, which they interpreted various arguments about this. Sometimes they call it social justice only, sometimes they call it a post-socialism, but socialism is one. And there is the Zionism pillar, just one of the pillars. And there is the Judaism pillar. It's Jewish values and Jewish religion and so on. Now, for example, in 2001, they had a big Veidah. They stopped calling, the terminology changed slightly. What they called moetzot in earlier years are now called Veidot. In Britain, they called it Veidot even earlier. The Veidah, in the Veidah, Chalutzik Aliyah was recognized as Hagshama of the Zionism pillar alone, rather than as the singular ideal of the movement. The term Chalutzik was interpreted as any form of idealistic actions within Israel which emanated from the movement's basic values. That rather than as the mere act of aliyah or the act of settlement in a kibbutz. The Veidah stated explicitly that one could, quote, achieve Chalutzik Aliyah by protesting against any policies of the government of Israel that contradict the principles and values of Habonim Dror. And at a subsequent Veidah in 2005, spoke of Aliyah as the highest aim and enjoined all its members to, I quote, explore Israel as a viable option. Now, it also made it clear that Habonim believes that there has to be a two-state solution. It's opposed to the settlement movement and the occupation without a search for peace. And in effect, it adopts the program, you might say, from a political point of view, of merits in Israel, which, of course, from a Zionist point of view, is totally legitimate. The Jewish community, which is predominantly right-wing, there isn't a strong Cherut anymore, Revisionist Party, which was very strong in earlier years. It's really all the national religious approach. All the shlichim and emissaries that come from the settlement movement. And the accusation launched against Habonim, which at one stage led to, even in the King David school, which is not the religious school, pronouncing some kind of ban on members of Habonim who were active in the school trying to bring membership to their movement. At one stage there was a crisis as bad as that because they were called traitors to Zionism. So they're under constant attack. Now, on the other hand, they are subjected to a society in South Africa today in which BDS and antipathy to Israel in the broadest sense is more powerful perhaps than any other single Jewish community faces in the world. Because the claim that Israel is an apartheid state, the forefront of this comes from within South Africa. Today, the African National Congress, which controls South Africa politically, with very little chance of this changing, hosts in its, for example, in the last few weeks, to illustrate the position, it hosts in particular Hamas. Earlier on, they allowed the PLO to establish a kind of embassy in South Africa. But now it's more Hamas even than the PLO. And BDS is very aggressive in South Africa. And of course, the line, as in Israel or anywhere in the world, between J Street type resistance to the right-wing national religious regime, you might say, in inverted commas, within Israel, the line between that and between BDS supporters is a very difficult and thin line, very controversial. It's the great controversy today that engages us all, both in Israel and outside of Israel. And all of this effervesces from an ideological point of view amongst the Jewish youth of South Africa. So the Habonim leadership faces that too. But in terms of the policies that have been adopted and the behavior, which has resulted in a small flow of aliyah, even though it's only an option as it's presented and not an imperative, there is aliyah. There are courses and activities that take place in Israel, and the official approach has maintained what I would describe as subscription to what the Geneva Convention people in Israel say, and what Meretz says, and what part of the Labour and centrist parties in Israel say. All those who seek, one way or another, to part from a concept of zero-sum game. It's either we oppress them or they will oppress us. Seek, therefore, to find a negotiated formula, and that this should take the form of a state that will also be provided for Palestinian national identification. Morally, apart from, in practice, saving Israel from becoming a state with a majority Arab population, which is more a survivalist issue for Zionism than a purely moral issue in itself. So those are the attitudes adopted. And they form a counter-cultural political group which very, in my opinion, boldly stands for these values within a community that is overwhelmingly not in that direction, and accuses them of being traitors, very much as happens even in Israel. This is a situation which exists in Habonim, which has become Habonim Dror throughout the world. It's a situation that exists in Britain. It's a situation that exists in the United States. It's a situation today also in Australia. This is Habonim of today. And that sums up the story of Habonim as I can tell it.
Thank you very much indeed, Gidon.
I'm sure it's nothing that people here don't know.
Not for sure.
We've forgotten it.
I think if we're willing, we could take some questions.
Giddy, do they wear uniform today?
Yes, they still wear uniform,
And
but in a,
are there Shtilim, Bonim?
yes,
Sholim?
they have an age group for every 2 years, co-educational. It's mainly a function of the needs of the camp. So to organize the camp in a better way, they're organized with 6 or 7 shchavot instead of the 3 that existed up to the end of the 60s. All this change started taking place in the 70s, apparently, and that's the situation today. Now, they wear a uniform which consists of a blue shirt, and this is the same in other countries too, and, not scarves, and waggles and so on. There's very little of the scouting, although they still have camping and so on. The camping is much more along the lines of what camping was in America, with housing provided, proper beds and so on, not camping in the Boy Scouts tradition of sleeping on the ground in tents.
Not in our days, we were in tents.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Today, but in the United States, camps from the beginning were the way they are today at Onrus. That at least for the younger age group, for example, they have proper beds, but they also have tents and so on. But it's not thing. But they actually have a campsite which is world class. It has its own beach on the ocean, and they actually own it. It's become an absolutely valuable property.
Very good investment.
Yeah.
You didn't mention a badge on the...
They have a badge, yes, which is not the old badge, which took the form of a brick.
Yes, with the deck.
Yeah. All over the world today, it's a different badge, which is influenced by the world Habonim Dror logo, but they do have a form of uniform, but and already I would say from the 1970s, the generation of young people just wouldn't go for Boy Scouts uniforms anymore. There's no question about it.
Lady there?
If you didn't mention the Shtilim, which was started from 8 years old.
Yes, that continues.
But when were they?
Yeah,
When you
but
said
it's
from
the-
12 on.
No,
No,
he
but
didn't
wait,
say it.
you said from 12, and that was the original
Yes, but
structure.
I omitted to mention that they also created a younger age.
When was the younger age?
It was that was already created in the 1930s. The late 1930s, a man by the name of Walchler in Cape Town created an ideology around the idea of saplings,
That's it.
and that became what was called the Shtilim Shikha,
We started
which was
at 8.
8 to 12.
Really?
So my name is Mayor Selaznik. I am totally British. I've never been to South Africa.
From the accent, we would never have
Although
guessed.
I should say that I was rabbi of a shul near to London, and we had lots of South African members. And on one occasion, I think it was a weekday mincha, and I noted there were 12 men in shul, and 3 of them were South African born. So I said, I think we have to thank Nelson Mandela for this minyan. At which one of them said, I have to tell you, I came to England to escape from Vorster. If the other 2 came to escape from Mandela, he came to escape from apartheid. So I have a couple of questions. When Wellesley Allen started Habonim, if his intention was a Jewish Scouts, did that not already exist, at least in England, in terms of the JLB?
There were, both in England and in South Africa and other countries, Boy Scouts units on religious lines. Jews were allowed to create a Jewish unit, but it was never a satisfactory, comfortable situation for Jews, particularly not in 1929, 1930 and so on. And so it was quite natural to say, no, there has to be a separate movement.
Okay, I was referring to the Jewish Lads Brigade,
Yes.
which was started in Britain as equivalent to...
That was people like Henricus that I mentioned. And the early involvement of Wellesley Aaron, he was familiar with these groups. But the inspiration was to create a Boy Scouts that was oriented towards Zionism and Jewish identity, and that became Habonim.
My other question is, you've mentioned about the right-left split nowadays, but was it always so? In other words, on one level, South Africa was more Herut than Britain was. When Herut wanted to come into the Zionist Federation in the 1970s in the United Kingdom, it had a lot of difficulty getting in. Whereas in South Africa, you already had people like Shimoni Katz, who was one of the first Herut members of the Knesset. So, were people like Shimoni Katz, were they in the early Habonim, or was Habonim always part of the link?
No. First of all, this question of Herut, I should say the revisionist party that became, when the State of Israel was created, that became the Herut party, mainly the Herut party. Now, in South Africa, it's not true that the revisionist party was the strongest of the Zionist parties. It was strong, but not the strongest. The strongest were always the general Zionists, which became the Liberal Party. But after the creation of the state, the general Zionists in the world, everywhere, wanted to become a non-party. They felt there was no need for parties after the creation of the state. But up to the creation of the state, general Zionism, which had a more liberal branch, because there were 2 wings in the world movement ideologically. There was what was called General Zionism A and B. B eventually became part of the Likud. The Likud is Herut plus General Zionists B. A became what was called the Liberal or the Liberal Progressive Party in Israel, and eventually blended in with the Labour Party, in fact. They've disappeared. Now, in South Africa...
Would that be Moshe Kol?
Yes, yes. In South Africa, in the 1930s, the revisionists became very strong to the point where, although they were not the strongest in the Zionist Federation, also the Zionist socialists, who were Labour, were stronger than them at various stages, in the 30s and 40s and 50s even. But they were the strongest in the English-speaking world. Remember that the great centres of the power of revisionist Zionism were in Poland. In Poland, that was Jabotinsky and Begin's centre. Jabotinsky came out to South Africa 3 times during the 1930s. At one stage, he actually stayed in South Africa long enough to lead the movement and create the only English-speaking newspaper that the revisionists had in the world. Came out in South Africa. Harry Hurwitz, who came to live in Israel and who founded the Jabotinsky Center, the Begin Center, he was the editor for many years. until Begin came to power and brought him in as a minister for the diaspora, in fact. Now,
England.
people like Shmuel Katz. Shmuel Katz was actually not born in South Africa, but he grew up in South Africa. And he was the earliest generation of the followers of Jabotinsky in the 1930s. There were several such people who had come from Eastern Europe and had already been followers of Jabotinsky. They created a strong movement, and it became, for Jabotinsky, the strongest support of money in the English-speaking world. After the Holocaust, it was crucial. When Beirut was formed, and was a small minority in the Knesset, with Begin as the leader, and they dropped from first 15 members to about 7 or 8 members, they were in dire straits. They had no financial support. It was weak in America. It had a struggle, as you said, in Britain. In Britain there was a strong general Zionist tradition, which went back to Brodetsky, the great leader of Zionism, and so on. And South Africa was, as he put it, my main centre. And he relied on support. So much so that the revisionists insisted in the 50s in South Africa in creating their own fund, their own drive, against the discipline of the Zionist movement. But they were not prepared to give that up because they felt that theirs was the responsibility to support Begin. And so they actually were expelled from the Zionist movement for a few years in the 1950s. So bad was the crisis. By the way, as an afterthought, one can understand how revisionists felt in the 20s, 30s, and 40s when they saw everything in Israel with a sense of opposition. You know, they felt alienated from what was happening. This is what Habonim feels today. The tables have turned. It's a very similar phenomenon. Sorry, that's such an interesting point. You launch me on another 6 lectures. That's a risk I don't want to take.
I remember Harry Hurwitz, in my time in the Zionist Fed, always used to say, "My teacher in Zionism." That was Jabotinsky, of course.
Right.
Any more questions? Lady there.
You didn't mention the Machon Madrifei Chutz La'aretz. Does that still exist?
Yeah. Now, one of the factors that led to the transformation of Habonim, first towards Aliyah and Chalutziot, well, I would say there were 2 main influences. One was the Shlichim. Shlichim came from kibbutzim, and they were mostly in the beginning, as I said, from Habonim in England. They were the first very influential Shlichim. They came with tremendous intellectual abilities. There was a man from Kfar Anasi, Michael Cohen, those of you from England who've known him, from Glasgow, and another Glaswegian from Habonim. Glasgow was very strong in Glasgow. And Glasgow also had a primarily Litvak population. Of all the Jewish communities in Britain, Glasgow was the most Litvak. And another was a man by the name of Joe Luketz from Bet HaEmek. They were very formative shlichim. Not to speak of those from Kfar Blum earlier, Mogi Margolis, I mentioned. And the other influence was the thing called the Machon Madrifei Chutz La'aretz. Now, the Machon Madrifei Chutz La'aretz, its first founder was from English Habonim. And he was who became president of the Hebrew University, Harman. Avraham Harman.
He was a Londoner.
Yeah. Avraham Harman.
They weren't shlichut.
Yes, he was.
Yeah, Avraham Harman came as a shaliach like you did to South Africa in the war period. And after that, when he came back to Eretz Israel, he was in the Jewish Agency and one of the founders of what became, they called it a post-matriculation course run by the Youth and Hechalutz Department.
After
of which for a few years Ian was director years later. And the Youth and Echelons Department created this, and the first group to come in 1946, before the creation of the state, for a year's program with the Youth and Echelons was from South Africa. They were the first group to come on the Machon. They came in 1946. After that, they were joined by a few others from England and the United States in years after that. And then hundreds over generations came from South Africa, from all the youth movements, including B'nai Akiva, which in those years was a relatively small movement, and including Beitar. And in that year at the Machon LeMadrichei Chutz La'aretz, there was exposure, first of all, to other Chalutz movements, particularly the South Americans, who, as I said, destroyed themselves because they weren't as educational and tolerant as the Anglo-Saxon ones were. And the influence was powerful. So that fed into the Chalutziut and the Zionism based on personal
Does it still
aliyah.
exist today?
Now the Machon, the Madrichei Chutz La'aretz, has undergone transformations.
In
And in principle, the idea of a year's course still exists, and from Habonim, South Africa, they send it. They called it they call it Shnat, which is a terrible distortion of the Hebrew language, using, Sivan, you would appreciate it, using the smichut on its own. Shnat Shelut or Shnat Hachshara, and they call it Shnat, which is terribly great.
They call the members schnotty.
Irritating to hear. And what do they call
I
it?
said they call the members schnotty.
Schnotties. So it still exists, and they come on courses, and it goes on. And at the same time, it's based on a conception of what is Aliyah and what is Israel, as I described it.
They spend time on the kibbutz.
I think this will have to be the last question because
What
we
is
have
the
limited
question?
time.
A comment is just as good.
When the Habonim made it the official policy of Aliyah, what was the reaction of the government in South Africa?
Well, look, the question of how South Africans, white, non-white, and so on, related to the way the Jews behaved, is a very interesting and ramified question. But let me say this. First of all, an interesting thing is that Afrikaners who lived in areas where Jews created hachsharot were dumbfounded and filled with respect. Not only Jews doing work, not only whites doing their own labor in a society based entirely upon a black, underprivileged proletariat, but Jews doing this. So there was great admiration.
But the government.
And this carried through amongst political personalities who knew about this. Now, in South Africa itself, there was a long tradition amongst Afrikaners of respect for Jewish alignment as an ethnic group with Zionism. In the bad years of anti-Semitism amongst Afrikaners, it was grist for the mill of Zionists who said, they don't want us. There's anti-Semitism. But most of the time, the moderate Afrikaners who worked for a united white South Africa, above all young Christian Smuts, were great supporters of not only of the right of Jewish life, but of Zionism. Smuts was a very important supporter of Zionism.
Giddy, wasn't DF...
He actually raised funds for the Jewish, for the Keren HaYesod.
Giddy, wasn't DF Malan the first prime minister of a foreign country to visit
Yes,
Israel?
now D.F. Malan, who was the first prime minister under apartheid, came on a private visit. He was the first prime minister to make a visit, but he came on a purely private visit. It wasn't a formal government visit. And his admiration for Israel was a strong factor in him ridding his party, as best he could, of anti-Semitism. Even though he was one of the anti-Semites, but he moved away from it. he dropped the anti-Semitic policies,
Yeah.
and even in a very strong and firm fashion. And he didn't believe that Jews should be separated from other whites. We should all suppress the blacks together. But the attitude in South Africa, right throughout the years of the development of Zionism, was positive. Habonim was the only Jewish youth movement that had official government-sanctioned status equivalent to the Boy Scouts and the Afrikaner equivalent, which was called the Voortrekker movement. So much so that, for example, Habonim had special rights on the railways as an officially recognized government organization. Now, to understand what that meant, Habonim conducted camps annually, the same ones that go on now, in the coastal areas, and brought people from as far away as the Belgian Congo,
And Bulawayo.
the Rhodesias, North and South Rhodesia, places like the ones from which Habonim members like Stanley Fisher came. He was a member of Habonim in Northern Rhodesia. And he was a Chanich in my generation's period as running the movement. And they brought them on a train that was given by the South African government, paid for but with special concessions, all the way down to the Cape. A 2-day journey. So that the camp started on the train.
On the train.
Was the best part of
It was an amazing experience. And they gathered people together down to the camps, sometimes numbering 1,500 kids. The average strength in the middle 60s of Habonim was about 6,500 or 7,000 members in the country. And as I said, today it's about 700-800.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in Johannesburg, my two older kids, who were they're really kids, used to go on the Bnei Akiva train on the same route from Johannesburg down to Mossel Bay or something or other like that. That was quite something. Right. Well, I would now like to ask Donny Mayer, who wrote the Habonim chapter in our book, The Jewish Immigrant from Britain, to propose a vote of thanks.
I think we've had a really fascinating talk. Both the parallels with English Habonim and the very specific South African aspects. You reminded me of why I was heart and soul involved in Habonim. And I remember my mother saying that I said to her, I only live from camp to camp. But I must say that I don't feel the same connection with Habonim Dror.
That's true.
And I've moved quite a lot rightwards, and I think that Habonim today is much more radical than it was, radical left than it was, maybe because of the influence of Dror, and evidence of what's happened in my family is that one of my grandsons had just come back from 3 years in Amsterdam as a shaliach for Bnei Akiva. And he told me when we met at Hanukkah, well, he realizes that Habonim was a little different in my youth, but he says today, what you said, that people may think of them as traitors, was more or less what he said, and he meets with them. He meets with the shlichim of other movements. And I think that's a little bit sad.
He grew up here, of course.
He's a Sabra, yes, yes. So anyway, I was really fascinated, and I want to thank you very much, and I think we should all show our appreciation in the usual manner.
I'd like to mention one result of my 3 years, or our 3 years in South Africa, is that my brother, younger brother, who's a rabbi, now retired in England, married a South African girl from Cape Town, whose brother is now the chief rabbi of Great Britain. His name is Brian Mothers. Right, copies of our books, The Jewish Emigrants from Britain, 1700 to 2000, are still available and can be purchased at a reduced price. Future meetings. For those of you who don't normally come, it might interest you to know that on Sunday the 20th of January, Judy Montague, some of you may remember from the days when she wrote for the Jerusalem Post before they were all fired, will speak about the cantorial achievements of her late father, the Reverend Charles Lowy of the Hampstead United Synagogue. A month later, on the 18th of February, we will welcome a return visit by columnist Barry Shaw, whose topic will be the Corbyn threat, an Israeli perspective. Our speaker in March will be that popular lecturer, Yankee Fachler. Thank you very much indeed. I hope to see some of you later. Follow code with that.
I'm still in the old place.
Stop keeping it fresh.